Welcome again to today's webinar, the launch of the LEAD program's Job Creation and Local Economic Development 2023 report, Bridging the Great Green Divide. I'm Karen McGuire, and I'll be opening this, and I just look forward to welcoming quite an esteemed group here today. So we've gone through question and answers, we've gone through the chat function, and just really look forward to an interactive discussion today as part of this forum webinar. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview. We'll start with some official opening remarks from the OECD Deputy Secretary General Yoshiki Takeuchi. I will give on behalf of the team a brief presentation of the report that we're launching here today. And then my colleague and lead author on the report, Lucas Klein-Ruschkamp, will moderate a panel discussion. And as you see here on the screen, we have quite an esteemed panel from a range of different international, national and local institutions representing government, the private sector, learning institutions, local and regional governments, and multinational organizations. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to our Deputy Secretary General to open this report presentation.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the launch of the 2023 Job Creation and Local Economic Development, Bridging the Great Green Divide. We must make a success of the green transition. That means taking urgent action to curb emissions and meet net zero commitments. It means phasing out emissions-intensive activities and investing in new industries, infrastructure, and technologies. But making a success of the green transition also means supporting vulnerable people and places. In other words, we achieve a great green transition, not a great green divide. The report we are launching today highlights the challenges and opportunities for different regions, sectors, and workers. It offers new estimates on the share of jobs that are green and polluting in regions across 30 OECD countries. The report shows that we have a lot of work to do. Across the OECD, workers spending at least 10% of their time on tasks that support the environment is fewer than 1 in 5. Firms report massive shortage of green skills, but the fact is that there has been almost zero progress in creating green jobs over the past decade. The share has only increased by 2 percentage points. The report also shows an emerging divide between places. In leading regions, often including capital cities, 30% of jobs are green, while in lagging regions, green jobs are less than 5%. On the other hand, we see regions at risk. Jobs in emission-intensive sectors may only account for around 12% of the jobs across the OECD, but they are heavily concentrated in regions that already lag on many indicators, raising the risk these regions are left behind as activities are phased out. We see a similar divide between workers. While the highly educated have benefited from green jobs, those with less education have not. And we see now a new gender divide, with women accounting for only 28% of workers in green jobs. These uneven progress threatens our societies, and it gets more unequal. And it also threatens our net zero emissions by fueling resistance and wasting talents. So the report sets out several policy recommendations, building on lessons from the past transition. First, we need to align environmental and labor market policies to generate skills needed to deliver on ambitious climate targets. We need to ramp up adult learning systems, provide better access to the vulnerable, and engage employers to align training with local needs. Second, we need targeted support for workers at risk of job losses, proactively engaging them in career guidance and retraining to transition to new industries. Third, we must encourage, inspire, and support more girls and women to pursue STEM subjects and careers in fields such as engineering or science, so that they can play a full part in the green transition. Ladies and gentlemen, this report provides us a glimpse of the great green gap that is emerging. We at the OECD regions and cities to take actions to close that gap and ensure that green transition is a just one. And together, we can pave the way for a great green transition rather than a great green divide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for opening with us, Deputy Secretary General Takeuchi, and for giving an overview of some of the key findings of the report. Now I'll give you, I think we'll just throw up some slides here, and I'll give you a little bit more detail on some of the items that the Deputy Secretary General mentioned. So this report is part of a series. Every couple of years, the Local Employment and Economic Development Program publishes its flagship report, Job Creation and Local Economic Development. This year's edition, in particular, looking at bridging the Great Green Divide, was developed because there's really a sore need for a more spatial lens to the green transition, what that means for different kinds of communities. And so the report goes through a little bit of what do we know about the green transition and jobs, and in many cases, what we don't know, as well as what are some of the implications for local jobs, skills, and economic development, because these, of course, need to go hand in hand. What are some of the lessons from prior transitions? This is not the first time local economies have had to change and their labor markets adjust. What are some of the lessons we can take there? And then concluding with suggestions on the way forward and different actions we can take. And I think, you know, that will then spark a bit of the debate and the panel discussion. Next slide, please. So we're going to just start by really helping you understand how did we define green jobs. And so there are different ways one can do so. They can be top down, looking at what are the different sectors that you're talking about, whether it's green sectors that are considered green, like environmental sectors, or maybe those that are more polluting. But you can also look bottom up and think about what are the kinds of jobs that we're talking about. And so for this report, we took an approach that was bottom up. As was just mentioned, it looks across 30 OECD countries, really zooming in at regional level as well. And the reason we chose this bottom up approach was because it can capture that regional local information. It can cover jobs across the entire economy. It's internationally comparable, and it really has a direct link with policy, because you can look at occupations, think about the tasks that they involve, the skills you need to do those tasks, and then the trainings that we all need to develop in order to make sure people have the skills to do the tasks for those jobs. So what we have defined, therefore, as a green job for this report is those that have 10% of their tasks that are directly supporting sustainable development. And you can see here on the slide some examples. So there are many shades of gray. There are also many shades of green. Here we give some examples that are looking at the different skill levels and also the sort of proportionality of greenness, if you will. We should flag, of course, most jobs are neither green nor polluting. They just exist, but we do have some that are extremely green. And so you see some examples here, whether it's solar energy systems engineers, or in some cases, maybe recycling material collectors. But you also have some that are maybe doing certain green tasks, a plumber who's repairing leaky faucets to reduce water waste. But again, many that are not green. And the reason that we highlight this is also to be able to understand who can easily transition as jobs change. So an accountant, of course, can easily transition to work for a wind turbine company and an extraction company. So you do have this transferability, but what we really want to figure out is where are we going to have these shortages in occupations and tasks. So what we've seen, and as was mentioned in the opening, the change has been rather slow. So when we apply this approach, we find that today around 18% of workers in the OECD have jobs with this at least 10% of their tasks that are green. This is up from about 16% of jobs in the economy a decade ago. But we do see some signs that the demand is picking up, and we see that through job postings. And you can see here on the other graphic that we actually find that green task jobs have really picked up and are in greater demand relative to some of the non-green task jobs. So what we see is sort of trends today, and then what we expect more for the future, especially as new environmental policies and others come into play. So one of the divides that was mentioned was the divides across places, and this question of the geography of green jobs. Very different situations across regions. You have regions that have less than 10% of their employment in green jobs. And then you have some regions that have over 30% and these are often cities. And so I just want to flag, and as you'll see in the graphic here on the right, that will be easier to see in the report when you have it on a full page, is just that a lot of the leading regions in the share that have a high share of green task jobs are actually capital city regions, and they so far have been capturing a large number of the increase in new jobs with green tasks. There's also a lot of within country disparities, and you can see here the ranges of different countries. In some, that disparity is not very big. It might be 5 percentage points or lower, but in other countries that gap can be rather large, 10 percentage points or more. We also look in the report at what you could call polluting jobs, because one of the big challenges is we have a bit more knowledge on the geography of those jobs that are likely to disappear as a result of environmental imperatives and transitions. And so we've mapped that out as well, looking at the occupations in non-green jobs, and then looking at those that are in sectors that have high emissions and a number of different types of emissions and other environmental impacts. Now, the maps here have a different scale, so don't compare across continents, but what we do wanted to point out is just that there are very different situations as well with respect to those job losses that are likely to take place, and that has important impacts for the nature of our local economic development efforts and our employment and skills efforts to support the transition of those workers. And across OECD regions, we see from less than 5% of jobs in the local economy that are considered perhaps polluting jobs to over 25% in some other regions around the OECD. So another divide that was mentioned was the divides by gender, and just so you can visualize some of the statistics that the Deputy Secretary General mentioned. Very different situations between green jobs with 28% only female, and then non-green jobs where you're closer to parity. So we really do see quite a difference that we need to address. And across the different regions, we didn't find any that had gender parity in the green jobs. And if you look at a subset of OECD countries that have data, you would need over 20 million women to change to green jobs in order to reach gender parity. So really quite a big task at hand if we want to have a more gender inclusive approach to the green transition. We also have divides on other fronts as well, and the issue of different types of workers in terms of skills and pay. So we have employees in green task jobs that have higher levels of formal education. You can see in the graphics here that over half of them in green task jobs have high levels of education compared to only about a third in non-green task jobs. So higher levels of formal education, higher skill levels, and a wage premium of 20 to 30% relative relative to non-green jobs. And perhaps what is a challenge in particular is that the workers in polluting jobs are those that are also least likely to participate in trainings. And so those divides across types of workers would likely increase without any further policy action. So another divide is actually by firm and firm size. And we can see here that actually a much larger share of these green task jobs are found in large firms relative to what you see in non-green jobs. So 31% of green jobs in larger firms with 250 employees or more, and only 24% for the rest of the economy. So a divide there that we would need to address by firm size as well, which calls a lot for local economic development efforts that are often closer to small, medium-sized enterprises. So now looking ahead, we have to think about, so what are we going to do about all of this collectively, and what is the way forward? So there are some lessons from prior transitions, and we have, of course, examples from coal, exit from coal, the impacts of digitalization, the impacts of globalization, a lot of commonalities that we can learn from. I would like to emphasize, however, one particular important distinction, which is that the green transition is currently much more policy driven. Of course, there are changes in consumer preferences, and as tax systems evolve, that will also change through market mechanisms. But right now, the burden to ensure that we have the right skills and occupations and people ready to do them, the burden is much greater on the public sector to make that happen. And so lessons from prior transitions, you know, if you take, for example, the Ruhr region in Germany that had an exit from coal, that was able to manage positive GDP growth throughout the process. They did a lot of the things that you see here on the screen that are good practices in local economic development. They also had a very strong link with unions and employers in these adjustment strategies, and really made that transition from what was considered a muscle industry to a brain industry. So we have examples in the report, of course, of other past transitions and commonalities and differences and examples. But we think it's really important to really highlight the importance of the role of policy here, given the nature of what's happening. And a lot of the regulations haven't fully come into play yet. And so a lot more is likely to take place in the coming years. And then to conclude the presentation, I really just wanted to highlight what some of the recommendations are in terms of different actions, and they can be taken by supranational, national, regional, local governments, but a lot of this requires a local lens in what we're doing. And I first want to emphasize the importance of these green skills coalitions, because the importance of having environmental policies be joined up with labor market interventions is going to be even more critical. We have a lot of investment packages, Green New Deals, infrastructure investment packages, but and a lot of regulations coming out, but if we don't have these things linked up, we're going to see shortages and crunch points, and we want to try to avoid that to the extent that we can. Another is really on the labor market intelligence, and we hope that this report and other reports that are coming out will help fill this gap, because this data gap is, of course, very important to inform green policies, especially information with a more localized lens that really gives a sense for students, workers, and employers on what they need to take into account in their decision making, and also for policymakers, training institutions, public employment services. And just to give an example, France established over a decade ago a national observatory for jobs and occupations of the green economy, and has been taking efforts to do a comprehensive review of curricula for the changing demand for skills in the green transition. So different examples that you might want to learn from as you develop the labor market intelligence. In terms of local adult learning systems, of course, this is a really critical point, because a lot of our systems are overwhelmed already both in trying to address the impacts of other mega trends and activities. And so already they needed to ramp up as people switch jobs more frequently, and as they need to reach out to harder and harder to serve populations. But the green transition is going to be yet another level and layer of work that they're going to need to do, both in addressing the strategies for regions, in addressing the strategies for sectors, and in particular also in supporting and providing incentives for employers and helping those small firms as well make the transition. And I just wanted to flag, for example, an example of SkillsNet that helps Irish enterprises anticipate labor market changes and upskill their workforce with a climate ready initiative. So different efforts to really engage with the employer community. Again, public employment services with a really important role on several fronts in order to support this transition. One on those workers that are in those jobs that are likely to be phased out, and what they can be doing to proactively identify them upfront, offer tailored guidance, as well as collaborate with employers in designing and delivering new training, in addition to offering services that reflect the effects of the green transition in terms of the types of trainings that they're using and the local labor market intelligence that they need. And just to give an example, Austria's labor foundations, which can both help with places that have lots of layoffs, where there's a very collaborative approach to addressing the needs of worker transition, but also in placement when you have lots of different employers that need support to getting workers trained up for the future. And finally, just of course, local economic development efforts more generally, because all of the training systems in the world won't make a difference if the firms themselves have not made those changes. And so that's why this report, we try to focus on the local and regional lens in order to understand what actions to take in sort of parallel on local economic development, and making sure it's linked with the employment and skills topics. So I've reached my cap here. So to conclude, just to say this was a very brief overview. The report should now be online if you want to get a lot more details with a policy brief for the short version, the longer report. And again, if you think in your country you would like a more country-specific presentation where we can go into more detail on the data for your country and on some of the examples that you have, don't hesitate to contact the large team that has helped produce this report, and many others that aren't on this slide, in order to perhaps bring this report presentation to your local community and your country. So I'm going to stop there, and I think we'll now turn to our panel, because I think they'll have a lot to say on the different actions that are being taken by their different constituencies. So I'm going to turn over to my colleague Lucas Klein-Ruschkamp to moderate this exciting panel. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for the presentation, Karen. We'll now turn to our wonderful panel to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities of the green transition for workers, for firms and places, and also what actions we can take to deliver not only a successful, but also a just green transition. So I'm delighted to welcome our panelists today. Barbara Kaufman, Director at the Director General for Employment of the European Commission. Deborah Revoltella, Acting Chief Economist of the European Investment Bank. James Gomm, Director, Equity Action of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Noelia Cantero, Director of the European Association of Regional and Local Authorities for Lifelong Learning. Yannick Paulet, Rapporteur of the Committee of the Regions and First Deputy Mayor of Berchem-Sant-Agat in Belgium. And Mustafa Kamal Ghir, Director of the ILO's Priority Action Programme on Just Transitions Towards Environmental. Now, this year being the European Year of Skills, I'd like to start with Mrs. Kaufman. Across the OECD, we see, and not only the OECD, but also, of course, Europe, we see widespread labor skills shortages. How can we address these labor and skills shortages that are holding back the green transition?
Thank you very much, Lucas. And thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I think it's So, good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here, and a great presentation of the report. So I'm looking forward to reading it all. I have to say that, yes, we are seeing increasingly evidence of skill shortages. Maybe during COVID, it kind of was reduced a bit, but then ever since we have a clear issue, and we see it also with employers complaining that they need help to solve this issue. So I think we would act on several fronts. Of course, you mentioned already the year of skills, European years of skills, but I would say there's up and reskilling, a big issue. Secondly, also better participation in the labor market of underrepresented groups. And then there's also something to be said about working conditions. So when it comes to the skills, you might know that the EU has set itself an ambitious target. By 2030, every year, every 60% of workers should be in training, at least 1 month per year. And we are also working towards, better skills intelligence. We have a structural dialogue on digital education and skills. There is now, as part of the overarching skills agenda, skills pact on different ecosystems, for instance, batteries, or different areas where employers, trade unions, education providers get together, assess what are the needs, and then try to act. We have now more recently the Green Deal Industrial Plan, which again has as one of the 4 pillars a skills pillar, where there will be a lot of work in trying to see how we can invest in skills. And then I mentioned there's also activation of people, because we cannot only do it through re and upskilling. We don't have the time. There's so many people out there, including women, older workers that go on retirement too early, the young who are not sufficiently integrated in the market, and there are also people with migrant background. So we have to do much more in bringing them in with their qualifications, or also up and reskilling them. So we have effective labor market policies and things of that sort where we are working on. And I would say, apart from activating those that are in the EU, there's also new helps to attract talent from abroad. I also mentioned the labor conditions, the working conditions, because we know it sometimes there are people out there that could provide their input, but they may not be attracted enough. So it's not a coincidence that we came recently with a proposal for minimum wage framework for the EU, that there is a directive proposed for improving working conditions, and there's also something on European care strategy. So there's a whole array of measures that are supported by various funds, where I cannot go into detail: social fund, recovery resilience facility, but often it's then member states that have to devise a plan in line with these guidelines and then take action, and supported by funding. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I'd like now to turn to Mrs. Revoltella from the European Investment Bank, because the European Investment Bank recently published its latest investment report. Deborah, would you be able to share with us some of the main challenges that firms currently face in their investment decisions, and in particular with respect to the green transition? And while explaining those, could you explain also what their impact is and how policy could actually help alleviate some of those challenges?
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's really an honor to be in this panel. And I really appreciated the policy focus that you have, and also the study that I found extremely interesting. And I'm really pleased to talk about this topic and the importance of skills in the I would say digital and green transition, both of them, because I think it's one of the elements that we find as one of the top barrier for investment in Europe and in the transformation of the European economy. In the investment report that you just mentioned, we underline this year a number of investment needs at the European level, and then we try to look at where are the impediment coming that are blocking this investment to actually materialize. And what we find is a number of important elements exactly related to skills. On the one side, if you look at the public investment, what we notice is that this time around, with the current crisis, the energy crisis, and the tightening of monitoring of financing conditions, we still see that public investment plans exist, and the Recovery and Resilience Facility is an important support to public investment. But the issue comes in terms of implementation, that it becomes extremely important, and implementation capacity at the local level. And there, what we show is something that comes from a survey that we have looking at 800 municipalities in Europe. And what we see is that these municipalities, they tell us that they lack access to skills that are necessary for developing investment projects. And what is important is not that they don't have these skills in-house, it's just that they cannot find skills in the area where they operate. And what European municipalities tell us is 69% they lack environmental and climate skills, 62% engineering skills, 58 digital skills, and then you go the other down, but you still have a lot of skills missing, and particularly the environmental and climate are quite important. And that's really constrained the capacity of the public sector to deliver on the investment programs that are there, even if the money are available thanks to the Recovery and Resilience Facility and other instruments. So really touching and doing something on this implementation capacity and availability of skills, in particular the climate one, is an important element, and we think that is something that on a policy point of view we have to address and address more. We do, but we can also think at other instruments. On the private sector side, we have another survey, and we presented the results. It's actually several years that firms tell us that one of the main impediments to investment is availability of skills. Again, it's 85% of firms that complain, and it's actually stably one of the top 1 or 2 impediments. This year is again the first impediment for firms to invest. And we were digging a little bit more on what does it mean and what are firms doing. And we have an interesting study specifically looking at the effect of training, if you want, what you do if you don't have skills. You can also think as a firm to train. And what do firms do when they train, when they invest in digitalization and then train? What we find out is that if training doesn't happen at the time of investment, the return of investment are much lower. So it's not only a matter that the skills delay certain kind of a transformative investment, but the return of this investment, if the investment is taken, is lower because of the lack of training. So thinking together at these 2 elements, the skills part and the training part, is particularly important. We also have a very strong focus on management. Actually, what we find out is that the single most important predictor of a firm's investment in climate action is actually quality of management. So if that's another angle that brings the importance of knowing what to do and knowing what is important for the net zero transition. And I think I will for now stop here, but to say that the evidence that we have also for Europe is very, very strong on importance of skills, both in the public and the private sector, to deal with the transformation on the economy, and particularly the green transition.
Thank you very much, Deborah, and also Barbara, because you already highlighted two key issues that we'll shed a little bit more light on in a second with our fourth and fifth speaker, skills and the issue of training and the lack of training that is. But Deborah, you also mentioned the term of quality of management as an important predictor of actually delivering and pursuing investments in that pursue environmental objectives. And I think this really links up neatly with our next speaker in line, James. James, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a global community dedicated to accelerate the transformation needed for net zero and a more equitable future. Based on your work directly with hundreds of CEOs, what do firms need to do or are in fact already doing to prepare for the green transition? And linking to this question, because we are all about policy here, how could the public sector actually help firms make the transition?
Great, yes, thank you, Lucas. Good questions. So happy to give some perspectives on behalf of WBCSD and the 250 or so multinationals that we work with. I think the sorts of initiatives that are underway at the moment basically fall into two key categories. We have initiatives that are underway within the companies themselves to try and build skills within the ecosystem that exists within the company, and then programs that are underway to try and drive skills acquisition across the broader ecosystem. And within the company, I think we're seeing efforts predominantly focusing around workforce planning, looking at the skills that are needed to deliver on the green transition strategies that companies have in play, assessing the workforce to identify the gaps that are there at the moment. And many companies are seeing that they have substantial gaps that need filling. And then assessing the transferability of the skills that already exist between the jobs that are likely to be displaced and the roles that are emerging. After that planning stage, a lot of companies then moving on to the people development side, so looking to scale up continual learning approaches for all employees, integrating into their professional life and orienting them towards their long-term aspirations. But then you also see initiatives to reskill, targeting specifically employees whose jobs will be displaced. And then also some companies now working to outskill as well when they know that a particular role is likely not to be replaceable, working to skill that individual to perhaps transition into another industry and coming together with partners in other industries to help achieve that. And then also training and incentivization of managers to support skills development as a core competency as well. So you're seeing some initiatives around that people development side. And then another key area that the leading companies are working in is around people engagement. So having a constant sort of people listening mechanism in place to understand how effective that piece is being. Then, of course, you have the broader outside of the company piece as well. So working with suppliers to help them upskill, another key piece, something that often gets forgotten about by many organizations, is that the critical importance of making sure that the supply chain is also skilled, and the role that companies have to play in driving those skills acquisition throughout their suppliers. And then, of course, in shaping the workforce of tomorrow as well, and working proactively there to send the right demand signals to the education system around the skills that the company needs now and the skills that the company anticipates that it will need 5-10 years down the line as well. And that can be increasingly difficult. So that, for me, is a key area where policy engagement and policy asks in particular will be important, is to really help to shape that workforce of tomorrow, helping businesses come together with the education system and with the public sector to try and drive that. Other policy areas that will also be important, formalizing multi-stakeholder dialogue processes, I think will be critical to make sure that companies are all engaging in the same way with the same standards. And then there is, of course, a need to mobilize finance for reskilling as well. And lots to be done there too. But in a nutshell, that's the sort of things that we're seeing amongst our members.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, James. We'll turn now to Noelia. Because Noelia, the report, and I think this has already come through the different interventions here already, the report clearly points out adult learning and re-upskilling as crucial elements for managing the green transition. So based on your experience, on your network, based on the work of your institution, what are the most important factors to future-proof local and regional adult learning systems for green jobs and green skills?
Thank you, Lucas. So actually, I think the factors, there are many. Some of them have been mentioned already, and probably they are not exclusive to the green transition, but they will be accelerated because of the green transition, or at least tested. So there are many, but I would like to highlight here 3 main ones. The first one, for example, is culture. I think we need a change in mindset where lifelong learning should be the norm and not the exception. Contrary to what most people think, and according to our colleagues from Ireland in UNTAS, the average adult learner is a young female with higher education studies. So this, we need to bring more target learner into lifelong learning. So we really need to change this mindset and embrace opportunities like the European Year of Skills, for example, 2023, or the European Vocational Skills Week that has been organized by the European Commission for many years now, or even the UNESCO initiative about learning cities. These are great opportunities that we will probably use to promote the need for a broader lifelong learning culture. The second one is the relevance to meet green skill needs. So for the time being, the social role of lifelong learning and adult learning should be promoted, should be strengthened, and the cooperation with the local and regional authorities should also be reinforced. In 2021-2022, we carried out a study in the context of an EU funded project that is called Regale, that is gathering regional authorities with adult education providers. And when we were interviewing those stakeholders, they all agree that for the time being, regional policies pay little attention to adult learning. This needs to change. And somehow the way to do it could be, as it is happening in many regions, is to gather, from a governance point of view, to jointly under the same departmental unit, regional policies dealing with employment together with regional policies dealing with education, for example, or even being creative and in remote areas, building up or setting up learning spaces that gather together employers and employees together with learners so that they can cooperate and see together how this green transition could take shape. And this leads us to the third point that I wanted to highlight that has also been mentioned by Karen before, and is setting up a skills ecosystem at regional level that are including the green challenges. So as we know, this regional skill ecosystem, they gather regional authorities, education providers, they gather employers, and very important civil society organizations. And we have many examples of those regional skill ecosystems taking place in Europe. For example, I would like to mention the territorial committees that are taking place in Brittany. So it's a way for the region, because it's a big region, to get to know what is happening at local level. There is an environmental committee, for example, that speak together with the employment committee, and that they speak with the employers and they speak with the education provider and try to meet the skill demands and the training provision and get them together. There is also the Skills Forum in Vestland in Norway, with the different regional county representatives sit together with the different economic sector. Or at local level, there is, for example, the Pact for Training in the municipality of Livorno in Tuscany that is also gathering all relevant stakeholders. So this could be a bit some examples of this kind of local partnership that are needed. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Noelia, for giving this very sharp overview of these three factors. I mean, it's some of the factors that we also call for in our work, really a change in culture to embrace lifelong learning, in the importance of collaboration in meeting skills demand, and then also, of course, the role of regional skills ecosystems. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to turn to Yannick Paulet. Yannick, based on your role as mayor and rapporteur of the Committee of the Regions, could you please tell us what is already being done on the ground at the local level to stimulate green job creation or support workers that might face risks during and in the processes and the changes that the green transition entails?
Yes, thank you very much, Lucas, and thanks for this opportunity to bring a perspective of local and regional elected people, like in the Committee of the Region. So it's clear that one of the things that we do at the local, the Committee of the Region, is really to underline the opportunity that represents the green transition, but also the risk that it entails. And one of the main risks for the European Committee of the Region and for locally and elected people is the risk of increasing the divide in Europe between poor and richest region. So this is clearly one of the things that is really important. what, of course, the Committee of the Region is proposing as promoting is to create upward convergence in Europe and not a bigger fragmentation. So we work hard to raise this awareness and also of the magnitude of the territorial divergence with disadvantaged and remote regions, which need EU support for long growth and really to increase. So what the focus is there is to support place-based policies, to have a solid territorial assessments and through a reinforced cohesion policy. And the Committee of the Region actually has launched an initiative, which is a cohesion alliance with more than 140 regions all over Europe, 137 cities precisely, to promote a strong cohesion policy. And as I said, to bridge the divide between poor and rich region. And that's why also regarding the RRF, well-known Recovery and Resilience Facility, we need investment in our region, in our cities, and it's important that this RRF, decided at national level, also comes in support to cohesion policy to have a greater investment impact. I also want to say that one of the claim of the Committee of the Region in terms of supporting poorer region is with the Green Deal industrial plan that was mentioned, is really to have a focus also on the social dimension. It's a bit the counterpart of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act in the US, where there is this social dimension and the support for quality jobs. And this must be the case also in the Green Deal industrial plan. This must be clearly for the Committee of the Region one of the key elements of our policy for the green transition. And it's also important to mention, as it was said several times and in the report, that workers must be ready themselves with the importance of upskillings and reskillings. There is a lot that is done in this regard in the Committee of the Region, especially for coal and carbon intensive region. We have specific initiative also for automotive regions. We have actually an alliance of the most automotive regions. We also underline the need for the construction sector in order to have a successful implementation of the renovation wave, which is renovating our buildings. And we have a lot of public buildings in cities and regions. And that's also clearly somewhere, I mean, or a sector where there could be new skilled workers. But it says in the report, and we want to underline that, unfortunately, that there is a big gender dimension to take into account, in the sense that, as it is said, that in most of these sectors that I just mentioned, the jobs are taken by men. So for regional, for national, but also for local authorities, there is really a big work that must be done in order to make sure that also women would go in these sectors and would work in the transition economy. And then just to very short, for the European Committee of the Region, we have two extra initiatives that we have launched for the local level. One is the Green Deal Going Local flagship initiatives, because we know that there is not one size fits all for every region in Europe to catch up with the green economy and to succeed the transition. And so this is an handbook that provides a step-by-step guidance, and it's adapted to each local context. And then the other one, as I said, is the Automotive Region Alliance to bring, because it's a big economic sector going to a big transition. We have seen that recently with some information coming from Germany about thermic engine, but that's also an alliance and a development that we are clearly developing in the Committee of Regions. So in a nutshell, for us, what is important is, again, to underline that to be successful at the local and regional level, the transition must leave no one behind. It's really, we need to have a policy that is inclusive and that must support the most vulnerable. And then we will ensure that we have citizen support to succeed with the green transition. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you very much indeed, Yannick. You basically foreshadowed my transition to our next question to Barbara Kaufman, because you put the spotlight already on the just transition aspect of the green transition. Barbara, Our report examines and emphasizes some of the possible distributional consequences of the green transition. Now, the European Commission, but many governments around the world strive for a just green transition. So how's the European Commission supporting a just transition to actually reduce the potential divide across people and places, in particular focusing on in terms of employment opportunities?
Yeah, thank you. You are right, Lucas. For us, this is a big focus from the beginning when President von der Leyen announced the Green Deal. It was clear, well, we want to be climate neutral by 2050, but it has to be fair. So basically, the word is if the transition is not just, there will be just no transition, basically. And one of the elements that we're doing is that we have a council recommendation adopted in June 22 that asked member states to put together policy packages in consultation with social partners and other stakeholders, including at the local level if that's possible, to promote access to quality employment, including targeted employment programs, but also subsidies for green jobs, to work on a skills element through education, training, lifelong learning, and then also through adequate social protection and social inclusion. So a full package, all with the idea that we want to support a fair green transition. And that is something that we are monitoring in the context of the European semester policy coordination exercise, but also follow up in our employment and social protection committee. So I think that's an important overarching element. Secondly, some of the funds that exist were already mentioned. So from the beginning, it was clear there are some regions that will suffer more than others, coal regions, for instance. And so what was put in place is the Just Transition Fund. And in order to get this money, regions had to put forward just transition plans, where they explain how they will support people, workers that need to find new skills and so on, in order to support concrete policy measures, 17 billion. Then what was mentioned also, the National Recovery and Resilience Plans, 723 billion altogether, and at least 37% of that must be put into green transition policies and 30% into skills and social policies. So there also every member state and the regions are working hard in making this a very concrete commitment. Then we have the European Social Fund, 100 billion for 7 years, and 5.8 billion of that are for green skills and green jobs, again, with the idea to support people. The Social Climate Fund, because now as this new buildings and road transport will also be part of the emissions trading system. And the money that is being captured, part of the money has to be used to support directly vulnerable households and micro enterprises that are affected by the green transition. And I have to say, recently, we've of course seen in the context of the energy price spikes, what are the kind of impacts that you can have in terms of energy poverty, in terms of transport poverty. And there was a whole array of like 430 measures at the EU, at the member states level to support, to mitigate the impact. And I have to say, only, because there the Commission is a little bit critical, of the 430 measures, only 150 were targeted. So I think there's still room for maneuver, for doing better in terms of focusing really on those that are most affected. Also, when it comes to a longer perspective in terms of green transition, this was, of course, this shorter impact. So I leave it there, but I think there's a lot going on in terms of making sure that this transition is fair and thereby also supported also in a longer term. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great comprehensive overview. I'd like to turn now to Deborah. Earlier, we discussed some of the bottlenecks that firms face in their investment choices. How are those bottlenecks related? And I think you already discussed part of it. How those related to regional differences and what measures could support regional cohesion in light of the risks of the green transition, but also, those risks being compounded by the current political and economic circumstances.
Thank you very much. And I think many of the things that Barbara just mentioned are really core also for the EIB activities. We clearly have in mind that the just transition, the transition needs to be just, and actually that the effort for cohesion region in terms of the transition is particularly strong. The situation is particularly challenging. What we see is that regions that are called less developed in the cohesion definition, they have a much higher share of jobs that are at risk for this transition. They have been more impacted by the energy crisis, particularly because of being more energy intensive and more dependent from Russian import. And also the capacity to react, or if you think at barriers to investment are stronger, and then the system is less capable to react. Also, another thing that we find that in a less developed region and in cohesion region overall, actually firms tend to see the green transition mostly as a challenge. Either they cannot assess what's the effect on their firm, or if they do, they see it as a challenge and much less as an opportunity. And then this reverts in something that we actually can quantify. We can see that the firms that are actually investing in climate action, they generate more jobs, and that is true both in a non-cohesion region and in cohesion region. But when you go to cohesion region, and particularly the less developed region, the upside in terms of job creation of the firms that actually invest in climate is much lower than in non-cohesion region. So in fact, you have much more challenge. And what it tells you is really that the normal barriers and the normal impediment that you have in a less developed region that restrain growth, they also restrain the upside that you may have associated to the green transition. And then this calls what to do. And then the what to do, I think, is a combination of factors. And one very important factor is going through reduce all the barriers that actually are impeding the regional development overall. And reducing the barrier, trying to tackle in terms of regulation and other factors, but also very much the skills part, even at the administrative point of view. It's incredibly important to allow the region to react and also take the benefit of the green transition. So this calls for instruments that are, there are a lot of instruments in terms of EU Cohesion Fund, the EU Social Fund, the Just Transition, the RRF, as Barbara was mentioning. But I think the combination of funds really has to come with adequate skills for the implementation. We call it a technical assistant or advisory, but it's very important to really properly use these resources and have the impact that we want at the local level. So we get back at the point of skills, having the skills for engineering the transformation that is needed, and properly use the funds available in order to kickstart the transformation at the regional level. And if this is done, actually the upside is possible and is good. We actually did a specific analysis on EIB on lending to firms. So the EIB is lending to firms for firms to lend to banks, for banks to lend to SME. And what we do, we track the SME that receive indirectly our financing, and we track them 3 years after they receive the financing. We compared what happens in a cohesion region and in other region, and we see that the impact of our own financing is much stronger in cohesion region and less developed region. And in fact, it's much stronger because it comes also with a technical capacity, and it helps the unlocking of growth to firms. So we think that a specific focus that combines the attention of technical assistance, the attention to skills, and also unlocking a new finance instrument is what is needed to take care of the just transition.
Thank you very much. Very insightful. I mean, describing how you describe this virtuous cycle of capacity support of financing instruments, and the issue of skills again. I'd like to turn to James Kaufman again. James, we discussed a little bit the role of firms, and clearly there will be no green transition without firms. So what are you seeing as the biggest gaps and bottlenecks in firms, in what firms already do with respect to making or using the green transition to support a more equitable future?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Luca. I think there's probably a fair few challenges and barriers that many businesses are trying to overcome. I think there is a concern generally. If we look, there was a CEO survey conducted by PwC a year or so ago, which found that 72% of CEOs are worried about the availability of key skills, and 52% said that a lack of skills were pushing up costs for them. So there's an awareness of this topic of reskilling, not just in the context of a green transition, but more broadly, and the need for action there. I think some of the specific challenges that are being faced in the context of green skills, first of all, is the pace of change and how fast things are actually moving. Many companies struggling to keep ahead of that pace of change, and to evolve with all of the new technological developments that are emerging. The need for localized solutions is challenging for many organizations as they are looking at changing in a particular geography. The need to develop tailored solutions to the geographies in which those changes are taking place, and to the individuals that will experience those changes, and that can take time and a lot of effort, and the need for good local partners on the ground. The fact that existing skills programs tend to be overly focused on training of higher earners is also a bit of a barrier to overcome. And lots of companies are investing in skills programs, but they disproportionately concentrate on the higher skilled employees. I think if you look at the US, for example, why 60% of the US population over 25 has college experience or a degree, that group receives 83%, of employer tuition. So there's a bit of a mismatch there in terms of where training is currently going, and a need for a mindset shift around that. And then, of course, the usual question of competing business priorities. It's often hard to get investments in human capital. It's often hard to measure returns on investment for these sorts of things, and to make the case internally. And so it's often hard, I think, for some of the teams that are trying to push this forward to get the investment they need, or get the green light to go ahead. And then, of course, I think usual problems around terminology, lack of understanding of exactly what a just transition is, what a green transition is. Some sectors getting heavily involved, and some sectors perhaps not yet aware of the crucial role that they have to play in pushing that forward. So I think there's some work to be done in terms of driving action throughout the business community as a whole, and not just the sectors that have been leading the way so far. So lots of challenges to undertake, and look forward to working with partners like the OECD to help us to do that moving forward.
Great, thanks, James. You rightly pointed out the mismatch between training needs and access to training. It's not a US specific phenomenon. We observe this really literally across most countries, across most regions within countries. That inevitably leads to our next question for Noelia. Noelia, how do we address this mismatch? Like, what can we do? What can local and regional authorities do to actually make sure that those individuals that would benefit the most from training actually receive it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lucas, and thank you to all the other speakers, because they have actually been already somehow replying to this. It's clear that in order to reach the ambitious goal for 60% of adults in training by 2030, we need to put a lot of effort together, and strengthen the cooperation between the public authorities and the education providers. In this project that I mentioned before, that is funded by the European Union, Regale, what we have actually seen as challenges, and I will briefly mention them because I know we are short with time, is that the first one that has already been mentioned is this mismatch between the demand and the offer. and not only regarding high skills, but also basic skill, as the previous speaker was mentioning. The second one is the reinforcement of the figure and the role of the teacher and trainer. Without professional workforce in adult education centers, it will be very difficult to face the complexity of future learning demands. So these are really two very important challenges to face, which are also, I mean, increase when we are talking about disadvantaged group. And so to those two challenges, when we talk about disadvantaged group, we have to add, first one, economic obstacle, sometimes as well the lack of a clear strategy from the education provider regarding outreach and involvement in new target group. And then the third one is no clear pathways of progression. So these are accentuated, as I said, with underrepresented group. What could we do? And I would like to propose a 4 measures very quickly because time is running. So the first one is to reinforce guidance services, to put some effort into providing the guidance services that this target group need, and also information that is targeted to them in particular. Also to have training format that are adapted to this group. So for example, we have a project where we are working with NEEDS. It's called NEEDS for NEEDS, and it's coordinated by Region Västra Götaland in Sweden. And we are co-creating the training material together with the NEEDS so that they get this sense of ownership and participation in the delivery of that training. And also fast-track integration into labor market, where we work with refugees and migrants. They were actually learning on the job German language in a busy kitchen in a restaurant. So that I think it's a very good example. The use of micro-credential could also facilitate this process as well, and it's something that we need to explore in Europe, I think. The third measure would be provide sufficient funding, and some of the speakers have already been talking about the resilient and the recovery and resilient funds. We need to put more effort into train the trainers and teachers, as I said before, and maybe also give these disadvantaged learners the possibility of providing some learning vouchers or individual learning accounts to make learning more accessible to them as well. The fourth and last point, also in line with this local partnership and with the communication from the Commission on harnessing talent in Europe regions, is that there is a need to have a strategy at local level in some territories to make them more attractive, to retain talent and to attract talent. Because as we know, in some territories, the workforce is shrinking because the population is aging or because young people are leaving. So we really need a strategy to make those places more attractive for those young people in particular. So that could be a bit in a nutshell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At the very beginning of our panel discussion, we talked about shortages and labor shortages, skill shortages. One of the things that Barbara Kaufman mentioned was activation policies. Now, I'll make the loop to this point, sort of frame the discussion. Yannick, I know you're actually involved in one of those programs that targets specifically individuals that have been sort of disattached from the labor market, long-term unemployed. Would you be able to briefly share what you're doing to get those individuals re-engaged and get them involved in green jobs?
Yes, thank you very much, Lucas. I think that is really a great project, actually, because it's combining a social purposes, so fighting long-term unemployment, and together with the green transition. So you have to have in mind that unemployment, long-term unemployment in Europe is about 5 million people. So it's quite a lot of people. And among this group, you have also a lot of young people, the needs. So the not in employment, education and training that are in that situation for more than a year. So it's not only people from a certain age, but it's also young people. So the starting point that we do in my district, but we're not the only one, it's also happening in France. Actually, it's called Territoire Zéro Chômeur de Longue Durée. So it's territory zero long-term unemployment. You have that also in the Netherlands and in Austria. And so we have three points. The number one issue is that there is not a lack of money. Why? Because the money is there as people receive already an unemployment benefit. So that money is redirected to creating a new job for the specific long-term unemployed person. And the fact is that fighting long-term unemployment does not cost more money actually than financing unemployment. So there in this initiative, people have a contract and a salary with at least the minimum wage. Two is that no one is unemployable. It means that when jobs are tailored to people's abilities and skills, we can find and define a job for them. So we put individual at the center with really a personalized approach, and to see that everyone has skills and know-how that can be for good use. And also participation is by choice and it's not mandatory. So really people can choose how to participate and how they will be engaged in that process. Three is that there is not a shortage of work, but there is a shortage of jobs, meaning that there is a variety of useful jobs with social and economic purposes that have yet to be created. So it's jobs for public goods. So let me give you a few examples very quickly. The kind of jobs that have been created in this social economic company or by local authority directly. One of really the different categories, for example, carpenter work for urban furniture with reused wood. It's a social restaurant with food that is locally produced or that are with products that are almost expired. It's a bike delivery, it's bike repair, it's everything that is connected with this recycling economy. Could be gardening, but you have also some more socially oriented jobs like support for elderly people. So this is really a new thing. It's social innovation. What is important is that very often unemployment is described as a personal responsibility. You are responsible of your status. And here we change the paradigm and the approach, and we say that it's a collective approach, it's a collective responsibility. And so everyone, and it's really a bottom-up approach from the local level, is creating a new environment with financial support. So I think that it's really a very good experiment. I would really, I'm available. I've done a report in the Committee of the Region on that subject. So really, I think that it's a great initiative to expand all over Europe. I mean, putting together social cohesion, green transition, and giving back confidence and hope to people. So, which is also a democratic element, I think, because in our society, people should feel confident and have hope in the future. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you very much. A very fascinating example that you shared, Yannick. I mean, that leads me to the point to point out that already has been shared by the team through the chat. Next week we have our big social economy conference, which also looks at part of these issues where how can we combine social missions with addressing social needs and addressing the needs of the green transition. Anyway, I'd like to now turn to our last speaker, Mustafa from the ILO. Mustafa, you have had the benefit of having listened to all our different speakers. Now the ILO has, of course, long-standing body of work on the green economy, on green jobs. Could you please share with us a little bit of the experience of the ILO and the most important factors that you identify in greening jobs and all the different dimensions of greening jobs?
Well, thank you, Lucas, and it's a privilege to be joining this very inspiring discussion. I think this report is important because it is addressing the issue of green jobs and just transition at the appropriate level. Most analyses that we've carried at the ILO tend to suggest that the job creation, job displacement are geographically distributed unequally. So there is this challenge of a temporal disconnection between the moment new job is created and where jobs are lost, and the geographical disconnection between where these jobs may be created and where employment may be displaced. So therefore, you can only grasp the scale and nature of challenges at the level of regions. Now, I wanted to allow me to make a point that we spoke a lot, I mean, panelists have spoken, and the report is also on green jobs. We have been trying to make this point that the greening of the labor market has to happen all over the place. and avoiding having to dislocate the labor market into certain jobs that are green and nice and other jobs that are sort of brown and dirty. We believe that the ecological transition is a challenge to have labor productivity go together with resource productivity in the way energy is used, in the way resources are used most effectively within enterprises. And this needs to happen in all economic sectors. So therefore, this notion of greening jobs is an important complement to green jobs as such. And what we find also is that in the measurement, the subset, and that is what the report also indicates, that the number of jobs that one could qualify as green tends to be a relatively small number. But what many countries are interested in terms of the investments they make in the green transition is to see not only direct jobs, but also indirect employment creation and induced employment. So that's where the massive scale of job creation can happen in labor markets. Just not confining ourselves with the relatively small number of green jobs, but look at the indirect employment creation and induced job creation. Now, I wanted to make a second point in terms of challenges we faced at the island, which is important to this discussion, which is that green jobs have to be decent jobs. We are avoiding to confine ourselves to employment in the environmental sector as such, but look at employment that is productive. And I think that's what the report shows, that those in green sectors, in higher skills occupations, tend to have higher wages, but that productive employment with decent income has to be in all occupations. The second element is rights at work. We need to have those working in these occupations benefit from all international labor rights, the fundamentals in particular, the question of social protection, and finally, social dialogue. So therefore, in the ILO since 2013, the International Conference of Labor Statisticians has come up with a set of guidelines on the definition of green jobs. And that definition doesn't differentiate between green jobs and decent work. So this is an important element because the conditions of work and the quality of employment have to be critical dimensions of green jobs. Then I wanted to just react to what has been said about the gender disparities. And I must say, this is quite in line with what we have also seen in our analysis in the ILO, which is that unfortunately, even in the green economy, a number of jobs are created in occupations that are currently somehow male-dominated, and that disparity and unbalance is reproducing itself even in the ecological transition. Now, there's another element of gender, which is that we've seen that often when countries or regions have policies for a just transition, which, as we see in the EU and elsewhere, there are programs of compensation, retraining, but sometimes they have focused, particularly in the case of coal mining regions, on workers underground, coal miners. But we know that these are ecosystems. They have a number of businesses upstream and downstream, which involve a lot of female workers. And sometimes those female workers have been overlooked in those programs of compensation and just transition. So therefore, we see the gender dimensions from those two angles, ensuring that we have more women in the new jobs in the green economy, but in programs of just transition, take into account the broader labor force that is involved, not only those in coal mining operations only. So finally, one point is that all the discussion here obviously is about OECD countries, but we know that there are many other countries out there which have different labor market structures dominated by informal workers. Now, how can we learn from the findings of this report, also work with those countries where there is a larger number of people in the informal economy, where issues of job creation are just one element, but also the conditions of work, the challenges of formalization. And then my last point is about financing for a just transition. I think we've heard from Barbara about the programs in the EU, which are very important and critically relevant. Now the challenge is how one can work with countries that may not have the same fiscal space to be part of this agenda of green job creation and face the same challenges of a just transition. Now, what role can international cooperation, international funding mechanisms on the climate space, and other mechanisms of financing for a just transition play? So this will be very important and also offer opportunities for sharing of experiences. I think there's a lot of good things happening within OECD countries that might be beneficial to other countries.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. Very, very helpful reflections, in particular, the fact that you pointed out that the greening really should be driven by all sectors of the economy, that we should also consider. And this is admittedly one of the things we were not able to address in this report, but future work should do so. Examine indirect job creation and induce job creation in local communities through investments in green activities, and of course the importance of having decent jobs. I mean, you also emphasize the fact that women are not only underrepresented, but also at the same time, to some extent, overlooked. And I think this is definitely something that we all have to be aware of. And finally, thanks a lot for these reflections on how we can actually take this knowledge and this evidence, the best practices that we have been discussing today, of which there are many more out there, and support developing countries that might have a more limited fiscal space. So I very much thank you. I in fact thank all the speakers, because we're now coming to a close. We're coming to the end of this event today. Our panel discussion clearly pointed out the magnitude, the scale of the challenges we face. But at the same time, I think it also shared some hope, because all our different speakers shared great insights on promising work that is already being done at the international level, at the national level, in firms, and at the local level. So our discussion clearly also pointed out and emphasized that the green transition requires action and collaboration of governments, of firms, of workers, national and local governments, all alike, all together. And that such action actually needs to be place-based. We fully recognize that this event today, the report of this launch, only marks the beginning of the journey. It's not the end. Our work supporting local communities, workers, firms in the green transition is not done. And going forward, we as the lead program of the OECD will continue to work with those different stakeholders, with different regions and workers to address skill shortages, green skill shortages, to enable career transitions and offer targeted support and analysis to individual sectors that are crucial for the green transition. So I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to our Deputy Secretary General Takeyushi of the OECD and our wonderful speakers. And of course, a huge thank you again to the wider OECD team that has been carrying this work for the past year. And finally, thank you all to all the participants for joining us today. Goodbye.